Did you see the pterosaur? It causes this big stir. A bunch of people go out there. This creature in broad daylight comes out. My name is Jason McClean, artist, illustrator, paranormal or biblical paranormal researcher, and honestly, the thing that got me started in all of this um, was sort of twofold. I was always into living dinosaurs and stories of that kind. Uh, my father used to take me to the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose all the time. But I was really, again, like all kids, I was into dinosaurs. And I had an experience in 1992 where I saw a living pterosaur. And I didn't believe it. I couldn't believe myself for nearly 20 years. And the worst part was while I was growing up, I was hearing stories about living pterosaurs, but they were in South Texas, right? I lived in North Texas. That's 700 miles away. So I just thought, okay, then that's way down there. That's the Rio Grande Valley. That's nothing to do with me. And then Ken Gerhart came out with his book, but again, most of that stuff was down south. It wasn't until really a few years ago. Well, I'm getting older, so it's probably more than a few years now. Found out there were other sightings in North Texas, which has sort of launched my sort of more public facing research. But I mean, I've been in paranormal slash cryptozoology for a long, long time. Uh, so again, really, I think it goes back to my interest in that encounter. But also just because I think, the world, if people are having these encounters, then the worldview that we have needs to account for them. And I didn't like the fact that the popular worldview doesn't account for these creatures, living dinosaurs, other creatures, things like that. So I wanted to research it to see if I could figure out why these things exist, why people are encountering them, and what does that mean for the world we actually live in.
Well, I think this is fascinating. I did not know that there were living dinosaurs still walking Earth. So tell me all about this 1992 experience you had. I'm fascinated.
So, one quick little point of clarification, just because there are going to be those who want to say it. Um, Pterosaurs are considered dinosaurs in popular culture. They're not technically dinosaurs; they're just flying reptiles. But you have to say that because there's going to be somebody who's going to be like, "Well, actually." Um, I was fishing with a friend of mine in the 10 Mile Creek. It's a creek that runs through Duncanville, DeSoto, Lancaster, um, and a few others, and connects to the Trinity River. The Trinity River is basically the river that allows life to exist in North Texas, because water is not native to Texas, and it's one of those things where North Texas specifically sits on a very large limestone slab. And so a lot of our creeks, the larger ones specifically, will cut into that bedrock. And so when I say I'm in a creek, I'm like 15 feet below, the surrounding area in this creek. It's a good ways down. And a lot of the larger trees and brush exist around the creeks because that's where the flooding happens, that's where the water is. So you really can't see down into these creeks, right? Well, there was and it's basically a sheer cliff all the way down, except for a few places where the wall has collapsed and sort of created this um, natural sort of like hill that you can go into and fish from the banks, right? It's usually not all that deep for most of the year, but there's a few deep pools where fish get trapped in, things like that, right? And again, it's like June, so the water hasn't all dried up yet. There's still a little bit of water there from the earlier rains. And so we were fishing, and it was getting about 11 o'clock. We were packing up. My friend had already made it up the hill into the tree line, and I'm wrapping up, and I'm walking up behind him. He's already sort of out. I hit the tree line, and I hear this sound I've never heard before. Again, it's 90s. I'm an 80s kid. You spend a lot of time outside, right? So I knew what everything sort of sounded like and was like, that's weird. The only thing I can describe it as was like an ugly crow. So I poked my head out because I could, when you're in like a tunnel, you can kind of tell the direction it's coming from. And it was just loud, and it was like, okay, I don't know what this thing is, so let me see if it's good, if I can see it. So I stick my head out from behind the trees, and at first, I think I see the largest blue heron I've ever seen in my life. Had a 8 to 10 foot wingspan. If you've never seen a blue heron, they're sort of a Payne's gray. It's sort of like a bluish gray. But I thought I was looking at a blue heron because it had the wing shape was correct. Yeah, and I'm looking at this thing head on. I'm sort of like in the if you can think about the creek, it sort of snakes its way through all these cities. Well, I'm in sort of like I'm literally in the middle of this straightaway, right? And it comes around the bend, and it looks like the heron. It sort of has that when herons fly, they have the way their wings curve down, and it's sort of just. And I thought I saw the legs. When a heron will fly, it'll have its neck in that sort of S curve shape where it's like resting the back of its head on its shoulders, and it sticks its legs out behind it. So that's what I think I'm looking at. And it's just so big, right? And I'm in an elevated position because I am up on that hill, right? I've kind of climbed up the bank a little bit on where the trees are, or where the start of the trees are. So I'm a little bit elevated. This thing gets its right wingtip is 5 feet from my face. And that's when I realized it doesn't have feathers. And what I thought was its legs sticking out behind it was actually a long tail with a flange on the end, like a little diamond shaped flange. And I just watch it glide the rest of the way, and then it just banks right and follows the creek around and disappears entirely. And I'm just sort of dumbfounded. And the friend comes down and asks if I'm coming, and I was like, "Did you see the pterosaur?" And he laughed, and he's like, I'm gonna go have a sandwich," and just leaves. And I realized, literally at that moment, it's like I can't tell anybody this. But I went back and I'm like, but it didn't have a crest, right? Because most people, you think pterosaur, you think pteranodon, which has the beak and the crest and a very, very short, stubby tail. And I'm like, what did I see exactly? And so I went back and started flipping through my books, and I found drawings of rhamphorhactoids. It's a smaller group of pterosaurs. Again, it's the 90s. Every time you see a pterosaur in a movie, it's a pteranodon. That's what the Flintstones had. That's what was attacking King Kong in the original film, right? They're because they're big, they have the crest, they look scary. The rhamphorhactoids were smaller. They didn't have a beak per se. They looked like a lizard, um, but they had like a tooth. It literally means toothbeak. They have a lot of teeth, and they have a tooth at the end of their snout, and they have a long flanged tail. And I'm like, okay, I couldn't have seen this because there's no way I can't be the only one to have seen this thing. So I kind of just like I know I saw it. I don't believe I saw it, and I just sort of tuck it away in my head for 20 years. Like I said, I I heard about the stories coming out of South Texas, but they still sounded more like pteranodons, right? I'm like, well, A, those sounded more like pteranodons. They seem to be a lot larger. And that's hundreds and hundreds of miles away. Again, for those who don't know, Texas is big, really big. Um, so in my head, I couldn't wrap my mind around the idea that I'd seen anything. And like I said, it was what's terrible is I had known Ken Gerhart for years before I told him my story. And like his first really big book was Big Bird, stories of pterosaurs in Texas. And the thing on the cover is a freaking rhamphorhactoid with the tail. Um, and my first sort of booklet that was using artwork throughout the centuries to show because again, I am an artist studying art history and archaeology, and it's like that I was looking back at these certain particular depictions of art. I'm like, you can prove through art history that rhamphorhactoids have been encountered for centuries. and that they're still alive today. I just didn't believe my encounter. It was I mean, it's comical when you think about it. And if you'd asked me when I wrote it, I would have been like, no, this has nothing to do with my sighting. It can't. My sighting couldn't have been a real thing. But Ken and Lau were doing a couple pilots for a show they were trying to pitch, and and essentially, I found out, and I'm on the video, giving my story, and I found out that there were other people who had seen something very, very similar to what I saw in southern Oklahoma. Well, that's much closer to me than, South Texas. And so I started my research in earnest of instead of going because I was sort of relying on my skill set, which is again art history, things like that, and kind of going through the accounts and being able to show that people have been encountering ramphoractoids that for centuries. Um, in fact, even the way we talk about the tail of a dragon, right, with that flange, that comes from a ramphoractoid that was killed in the 15th century. So I started finding more and more and more people in this area that had these encounters with a creature that that looks like a ramphoractoid pterosaur, and they all tell me the same thing. And a lot of these encounters are within either honestly a half bunch of them were within like a mile or 2 miles of my sighting, and one was like 8 miles. One was just a little bit further out and further north in Fort Worth, but really not that far away, all things considered. Particularly when you're talking about something that's flying. And I realized how many people had this encounter, and they all literally said the same thing. I thought it was a pelican. I've gotten that. I thought it was a crane. One said an owl, but it's because it happened at night. These things do seem to be nocturnal more than anything else. Um, but they all said the same thing. I thought I was looking at a normal bird, right? Something like a pelican or a crane or a stork because of how they fly, because that's what they sort of look like. But then then these people got a second look at it and they realized they weren't looking at a pelican or a crane or a heron. They were looking at a pterosaur, and they're like, what do I do with this? Right? One woman, again, person known to me personally, was driving and she thought it was an owl because it flew because it was at night and it flew in front of her car. But she thought it was an owl when it passed uh by her window. And then when it pulled in front of her and went in front where the lights were, that's when she saw it, and she's like, "That's a pterosaur." She's like, "I have a ton of brothers. They all had these dinosaur toys." She goes, "That's what I was looking at." So everyone says the same thing. They think it's something normal, and then they get a closer look, and they all describe it the same way. So for me, I'm 30 seconds on any given day from saying all this stuff's paranormal, but that isn't what happens with the paranormal, right? Um, Usually it's something weird off the top. You can feel it. These are just people seeing something and then they take a closer look. And then it occurs to me, it's like, you know, I didn't believe my own sighting. And if I had went around telling people I'd seen a pterosaur, no one would have believed me. Everyone's probably in that same position. In fact, everyone told me. They're like, I didn't know who to tell. But once I started saying, hey, I'm writing this book, I'm working on this, people came to me and they're like, hey, I got to tell you something, right? A couple people I just said, hey, have you ever seen, while doing research for my book, they were like, hey, I was like, hey, have you ever seen anything weird? And she said, and one woman said, describe weird. I said, anything out of the unusual that you wouldn't want to tell somebody because it just seems too weird. And she goes, well, let me tell you this one story. And it's a pterosaur, right? So many of the accounts that I've taken start off like that, where it's, what do you mean by weird? I'm like, and I don't tell them, hey, have you seen of a pterosaur? Just anything that you wouldn't really, that you'd feel uncomfortable telling people because they'd laugh at you. So many of those stories end with, I saw a pterosaur, or I don't know what I saw because it was dark, but this thing flew over my car, or it flew over, I was driving home from the desert coming in from the west, from West Texas. This thing flew over my car and I didn't know what it was. So many of those accounts start that way, where they're either, I saw something, I thought it was a bird of that I know then I got a closer look. Or it's just so big they just use the word bird, but they couldn't get a good enough look at it to know what it really was. So it's just so consistent. It has to be a living population of these creatures. And again, the descriptions are very, very consistent. Again, with paranormal, there tends to be a lot of inconsistency with their overall appearance when it comes to fine details. Everyone's telling me the exact same thing, and these are unconnected people. They don't know each other. And it would be one thing if they were telling me stories about a pteranodon, right? Something that was in the popular culture, I would be a lot more skeptical of, but it's not. They're telling me these stories of creatures that are not in the popular culture. They're not sitting there in the zeitgeist to sort of contaminate uh, people's minds. And so it's far more consistent with a living population of creatures than anything else.
Well, that's fascinating. So are they primarily witnessed in the United States in that Texas-Oklahoma corridor?
So, no, a lot of so there's actually a couple different types of pterosaurs that are seen. Some do appear to be pteranodons. At least that's the theory out in Papua New Guinea. There's the Kongomodo out in Africa, but here in the United States, like I said, in the South Texas, they appear to be much, much larger and appear to be pteranodons. The things seen here in North Texas, southern Oklahoma, and out west seem to be more ramphoractoids, but they're seen in Georgia, California. I've got some reports coming out of Michigan. I've got reports of these things all over the country. Um, so it's hard to know since they are so large. Like even this again, even when I saw it was 8 to 10 feet. I mean, birds are known to migrate thousands upon thousands of miles. Uh, Sea turtles do the same thing. And again, I think we need to look at the more sea turtles. People keep looking for nests like they're birds, and it's like these are reptiles. They don't have nests like that, right? Um, and they don't really, they would just be entirely migratory. They wouldn't really make a nest like that. You got to think more like a sea turtle. I mean, sea turtles go for tens of thousands of miles. So it's entirely possible these creatures have a range of the entire country. There does, however, seem to be a very consistent North Texas and then moving out west, uh, sort of, uh, pathway. I've got a lot of reports coming out of Crosbyton, Texas, which is just outside of Lubbock. It's like a 5 hour drive from me. Um, and the thing about it is there's a lot of canyons. There's a lot of crevices for them to sort of catch that glide path, right? I think my current working theory is that the North Texas is sort of where they breed, and then when they get a little bit bigger, they move out into so the larger open desert where there's more areas to sort of a lot of rocky crevasses to sort of get in and hang out when they want to hide, and then when they to get air when they want to fly. That's why I think it was in the creek. And it does seem to be very connected to the 10 Mile Creek area. Uh, Again, because it's deep, you have more air channels for them to glide. They don't have to use as much energy to do it. So it does appear that there is at least a group that is North Texas to West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona area. Is it the same group of creatures? They're sort of flying everywhere and all over the country? Maybe. Are we seeing different populations? Also possibly. Um, one of the other theories I've talked to Ken about is it's real possible that what we're actually seeing isn't two different species. Like I said, the ones around that have been seen around the Rio Grande Valley appear to be more of a pteranodon. They have larger crests. They seem to have a beak, that kind of thing. However, and they are much, much larger than the 8 to 10 foot one that I saw. And that everyone seems to say the same thing around here in North Texas is they're 8 to 10 feet, right? As far as the wingspan, which makes it big, but not so, not the size of a small plane like a Cessna, like some people are talking about seeing. However, it's entirely possible that what we're seeing isn't multiple species, but rather one species at different stages of development. There's a very famous story that the Jonathan Whitcomb collected from a soldier in the 60s, and he was in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, and he saw this creature multiple times, but in just flying around at long periods of times, and he drew this creature, and it looks like a pteranodon, right? It has the crest, and it seems to have a beak, but he draws teeth on it, and it has a long flanged tail. And he said this thing is about the size of a small plane, and there's several other accounts of creatures that size. Um, and it's one of those things where it's entirely possible that because I do have one account. Actually, I'm sorry, I have two accounts of the creatures here in North Texas having a very small crest on their head, and that could be explained through sexual dimorphism. Because the one I saw didn't have it, and it was a grayish blue, or bluish gray, and the other and a couple others saw it had the ones that had the crest was more of a rusted reddish color. Um, and that can be explained through sexual dimorphism. But it's entirely possible that what we're seeing is one species at multiple stages of its development. That early in the age, earlier in its age, it's smaller, obviously, and that's when it's kind of doing a lot of stuff. But then at a certain point, they just get much larger, and that's when they move into another territory. Again, we see this with all kinds of reptiles. When they're small, they stay in like crocodiles or alligators, right? They'll stay in this shallower waters. Same thing with sea turtles. They'll stay in shallower water. But when they get to a certain size, then they go into the open ocean or they go uh, out into the deeper parts of the swamp or whatever body of water they're inhabiting. So it's entirely possible that we're not seeing different species per se, but rather different stages of development. Now, again, the ones out in Papua New Guinea may be an entirely different species. We just don't know until we have the body of one, to actually study. I don't get me wrong. I'd love for these things to be captured alive, but that's just not realistic at this point. Um, so until we have, bodies that we can examine, do DNA testing, and actually get a good look at, it's going to be hard to know what's what until we can, until we have corpus delicti.
Well, yeah, I would say so. Now, what do these things feed on? Do you have any idea?
Well, again, at this point, no one knows anything, but there's a theory that they may um, be scavengers. There's several accounts of the larger ones in the Rio Grande Valley actually interrupting uh, funerals and breaking up funerals and trying to steal the body in some of these open air areas. It's also entirely possible that again that may just be that if it is a different species, it could just be that species as a scavenger. Um, the ones seen here in North Texas and Southern Oklahoma seem they're often seen around bodies of water, which is not overly surprising. Everything needs to drink, but they could also be. It's often been believed that a lot of the ramphoractoids were fish. They would eat fish, so it's possible that's what they're doing. They're looking for fish. So again, at this point, it's too. We just don't know. There's no reason, and it's one of those things where it's pure speculation at this point. However, the two working theories are scavenger or uh, or a fish hunting, sort of like any like a pelican or any other fish eating bird. But it's possible that they're both, right? This is one of those things we tend to miss because we like to say, oh, this thing's an herbivore and this thing's a carnivore and this thing's a scavenger. No, everything scavenges, everything hunts, right? Just to certain degrees of practicality. One of my favorite little things that we learned when people started setting out uh, like just dead animals, right? They to do scientific studies on to see what would come and scavenge off the body. Almost the first thing that shows up every time are deer. To And deer will eat they'll eat and scavenge off of a body. Um, everything eats everything, right? Again, I'm a Texan. Anyone who's spending time on a farm will know you got to keep the little chicks away from a cow because a cow will see a chick and eat it if it can. So it's possible that it may be that it's both a scavenger and a fisher. It's possible we are looking at two different species, but any thoughts are really more of a are more of a speculation. One theory I did hear, and I find this one really amusing. There's a place in Texas I've never been. It's on my bucket list. I got to see it. But again, Texas is really, really big. It's Marfa, Texas, and there's the famous Marfa lights, and they've been out there for a long time. My grandfather, my father's side, again, my family's been in Texas for 5 generations. Um, he knew about it as a kid. A lot of people said, "Oh, Marfa didn't come up until people started seeing until automobile lights, and you're just seeing the highway." And it's like my grandfather's like, "No, I heard about Marfa when I was a kid." Um, there's a theory because in Papua New Guinea, it looks like they call it the rope in there is bioluminescent. This has been one of those things where it's controversial, but it's a big point. And so there's a thought that the ropen are bioluminescent. Well, there's interesting evidence to indicate that maybe the ones here in North Texas also are bioluminescent. It's at this point it's nowhere near confirmed, but there's some good evidence that maybe they could also be bioluminescent. Well, the theory then went out. This is not my theory, but I do find it amusing because I think there's some there. It could be possible if they are bioluminescent that the Marfa lights are actually these pterosaurs bioluminescing to attract insects, and the insects attract bats, and then the pterosaurs eat the bats. So it's one of those things where we just don't know. But there's a lot of theories right now. The two most prominent though are scavenger and fisher.
Well, I grew up on a farm and I never heard of a cow eating a chick.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, if that cow's close enough to that chick, it'll absolutely eat it.
Had no idea. They normally eat grain and grass.
Well, so that's the thing, right? There's no such thing as an herbivore. There's no such thing as a carnivore. Everything eats everything. Everything's an omnivore. They're just on a spectrum, right? Um, Obviously, a cow is going to eat grass 99 times out of 100, but if it has the opportunity to eat something small enough, it'll do it. Deer, same thing. Again, deer will, rabbits will scavenge off of a carcass. Um, Everything eats everything because it's just calories, right? But the thing is, let's face it, deer are not really set up to be hunters. Same thing with cattle. They're not really designed to to make a meal out of another animal if but opportunistically they absolutely will. I've seen it happen. And it's freaky the first time you see it. You're like, what just happened? But yeah, I mean everything will eat everything given the opportunity. What we call things carnivores and herbivores and omnivores, but really it's just where do you sit on the spectrum of being an omnivore, right? Are you an opportunistic everything's an opportunistic scavenger given the opportunity, again, given the opportunity and within certain degrees. But it's just, yeah, I mean, it is weird the first time you see it because it is in the first time you see a rabbit eating off of a dead animal, it's freaky because you're like, something's wrong. This can't be right. What kind of twilight zone have I fallen into? But nature's weirder than we want it to be sometimes.
Exactly. So this has been fascinating, but do you have any information or knowledge about Bigfoot?
Yeah. A lot of my research has actually been in Bigfoot with Texas Front Porch. And the guys over there, we do a lot of research out of southern Oklahoma, in Thackerville. And again, there's a large history of Bigfoot here in North Texas. People tend to forget the Lake Worth monster was one of the biggest Bigfoot encounters in North American history. People, for those who are unfamiliar with the Lake Worth monster, it happens in the 60s. And essentially, there were reports of people seeing a thing or encountering a thing, but everyone, the police didn't take it seriously. It's out in Lake Worth, and it's back in that, and again during that time, a lot more wooded than it is today. But even today, you can go to the nature preserve where a lot of this actually took place, and it's very, very wooded. And essentially, there's some couples out there. They're just parked out having a good old time, and this creature comes at them. Well, they freak out. They go to the cops, and it makes the paper. Jim Mars, the reporter, wrote about it. He called it the Goat Man because they described it as looking, like a man with with fur. Anyway, it causes this big stir, right? And so a bunch of people go out there. And of course, the cops are worried because, like, we don't want a bunch of people with guns roaming around the forest. So they go out there. So they go out there to sort of dismiss the crowd, right? And in front of dozens of people, multiple police officers, this creature in broad daylight comes out, screams at them, and starts throws a tire at them. Everyone freaks out, including the cops, and they all get out of there. Well, this is big news. This was huge news around the country. And this was we had just landed on the moon, and or the moon landing would happen later that summer, so it kind of goes away. But there's a long, long history in here in North Texas about Bigfoot. We used to call it the creature or the monster, and it was known from the 1800s. In fact, an early sighting that BFRO has up is in Waxahachie, which is where I live now, and it happened in the 30s. And I know roughly about where the sighting was because of the description that the guy leaves. He's like, we were here from this, from this point in this creek. I know where they were. So there's a long, long history of Bigfoot here in North Texas, and it's one of those things where they seem to get as close to civilization as they want, right? There doesn't really seem to be a big push for them. Everyone's like, oh, they're being pushed further and further out. They seem to go wherever they want to go. That having been said, though, I think there's also a large um, connection to the paranormal. Not necessarily that Bigfoot itself is paranormal. I'm not there yet, but I think the thing is there's a lot of paranormal out there that people are either mistaking for Bigfoot or the paranormal entity wants to be thought of as Bigfoot. Um, and the evidence I would give for that outside of my own personal encounters in Thackerville is there's stories again. You go back to the 60s, right? And Jim Mars calls this Lake Worth monster the Goat Man. Well, that name gets thrown on top of a lot of locations where there was already some paranormal activity, or if somebody sees a Bigfoot uh, in that area, it becomes the Goat Man, right? Instead of everything being called by some sort of regional name, the creature, the monster, or whatever, they all become Goat Man. Well, the thing is, with the name, people start envisioning it as a satyr, right? Like it is a goat man. Well, now we have accounts of people actually seeing goat men, like at Lake Worth, uh, the old Alton Bridge. I've got an account of something around Old Alton Bridge that doesn't even look like a goat man, but it's a thing. And the White Rock Lake goat man, again, one of the more again one outside the old Alton Bridge. It's one of the more famous goatman stories in North Texas. Um, you get like a mile or so away from that lake, the creature seems to change. It's not a full-on goat man. It almost looks more alien. It's thinner. It loses the horns. It still has the backwards facing legs, but it's more streamlined. It's like it's losing that goat accoutrement. Uh, so it's entirely possible that a lot of people, particularly when you have a lot of the more uh consistent sightings, um, or it's like, hey, it's on my property because all evidence seems to indicate that Bigfoot are migratory, or maybe not even migratory, more nomadic, like any great ape, right? They're constantly on the move. So when you have these things where it's like, oh, it's always on my property, and then you're like, okay, you start exploring a little bit more. You start having, you find out about people saying, oh, it's telepathic or it disappears or whatever. That's far more consistent with the paranormal than, say, a living, breathing creature like a dog or a cat. So it's possible that with Bigfoot, we have one of the problems we have is that we have this big box and we're throwing everything into this box and labeling it Bigfoot. And there may be that we have multiple phenomena that we're trying to cram together, and maybe that's on us, or maybe the paranormal wants us to think it's Bigfoot, so we're putting in that box so we don't recognize it for what it is. Um, Anything beyond that is speculation, but we kind of need to take some of these things out of the box and say, okay, there's reason to think that people are seeing and encountering living, breathing creatures. But then there's these other accounts that are often labeled Bigfoot that don't really read the same way. They do read as something far more paranormal. Its eyes glow, not eye shine. They are glowing. They appear and disappear at will. They move in places that really they shouldn't be at all. No physical evidence, right? Telepathy or telepathic communication. It's it's far more consistent with or and people seeing the same creature or supposedly the same creature in the same area, same location, but it looking radically different. That's far more consistent with something paranormal than something physical. So yeah, we've got Bigfoot here, but we also have something else that maybe wants us to think it's Bigfoot, or maybe it's simply taking on whatever form uh we want it to that we're familiar with as a way of interacting with us, or perhaps the way we envision something actually gives the paranormal the ability to interact with us. But we seem to have a bit of both going on, and we've seen it here in North Texas. We see it in Thackerville, and it's just a nice weird old uh grab bag of what the heck is going on.
Do you think there's a possibility there is a flesh and blood Bigfoot, but then there's
Mhm.
also something that is trying to present itself that's just paranormal, that's not flesh and blood?
Yes. Yes, because again, the things that are like we have a really consistent set of physical evidence for Bigfoot, right? We find kills that appear that don't match up with other known animals. We have obviously the footprints, which are really, really consistent. Um, there's I don't want to speak for other people, other researchers but it should be coming out later this year, early next year. Um, Skin samples, skin oils, looks like we may be able to prove through genetics that there is at least a large primate. Again, skin oils being something that's unique to primates. So there's physical evidence that's inconsistent with a lot of paranormal activity. Uh, However, and this is where I'll throw a monkey wrench into my thought as well. This is all predicated on the idea that paranormal creatures cannot become physical, or if they do become physical, that they wouldn't leave organic traces, right? That's where the whole thing sort of falls apart until we have something a little more substantive, unfortunately, like a body. It would be hard to say that the paranormal isn't capable of becoming physical and leaving the same trace evidence. But at the moment, my level is we don't really see that kind of evidence with paranormal entities. So consistency of foot of trackways, again, morphology, shape, size, and again we see uh, a proper distribution for living population. Right, the vast majority are about a certain size. We see on the extreme end some that are really really small, some that are really really large. That's consistent with a living, breathing population of animal. But like I said, there that is sort of an assumption that we have that the paranormal wouldn't be doing that. So, but at this point, it would be speculation to say the that it's the same that's the same thing. I think it's much more likely that what we have is a very small, you know, population of primates or hominids walking around, just doing their thing, right? Just being themselves. Um, but then we have this other far more prevalent paranormal these paranormal entities that are again either we're putting them in the box as Bigfoot incorrectly, or they want us to think they're Bigfoot. And this is the example I use all the time. You wake up in the middle of the night and there's a 8 foot tall dark humanoid figure with red glowing eyes at the foot of your bed. It's a demon, it's a shadow person, it's whatever word you want to call it, right? However, you open your tent at 2 in the morning and you see the exact same thing. Suddenly it's a Bigfoot. And it's the same phenomena, just we're calling it different things because of the location that we see it at. Now, the question becomes, if it is a paranormal entity or entities, why would they want us to think that they're Bigfoot and not what they really are? And to be honest, I think it's because we let our guard down if we think it's something material. C.S. Lewis in the Screw Tape Letters has this speculation of what he calls the materialist witch, where at some point, the premise of the Screw Tape Letters is demons writing back to each other, back and forth, like correspondence. And they speculate that there would be a way to make humans interact with the supernatural without ascribing to it supernatural a supernatural entity, that it would be essentially a materialist, that so he calls it the materialist witch. Well, if these entities are roaming and doing things, but we ascribe to it a material presence like Bigfoot, then we don't recognize them for what they are. And this is the question I've been asking for a while. Where's the line between research and worship? Because what's the first thing we do when we hear about that people do when we hear about a Bigfoot sighting? People run out there to go look at it, right? They're like, well, can we see it? Let me go find it. Let me go to this area. And we buy tchotchkes with Bigfoot on it, right? Is it possible that these creatures want that these paranormal entities, these demons, want us to think that they're Bigfoot in order to open us up to interaction, to uh, giving them power, to giving them access to us? And that's far more consistent uh, with what we actually see than everything being material. But also, again, like I said, we have evidence that's inconsistent with the paranormal. So I think what we have are two different phenomena: one physical, just doing its thing; the other one very, very predatory, and probably far more a far larger percentage of Bigfoot sightings than we realize are actually of this paranormal phenomenon that wants us to think that it's Bigfoot because it is predatory. It is feeding off of us. It's wanting to entangle us with it.
Let's go back to this idea that, flesh and blood versus, something that's paranormal
Mhm.
that isn't flesh and blood, and the potential of that fusing to be one and the same. Have you studied ghost at all? Because I'm going to kind of go down that avenue for a minute.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm actually not a believer that okay, so there's two types of hauntings, right? You have the sort of repetitive, non-intelligent hauntings, and you have the intelligent hauntings. Um, the non-intelligent hauntings seem to just be repetition of an event on space-time, right? Like if you had written for those of us old enough to have written things down on paper on notebooks, right? If you write hard enough, you can take a pencil on the page underneath and you can literally read what you wrote on the other page, right? Because of that pressure. The non-intelligent hauntings seem to be something like that. That's why we see ghosts, quote unquote, ascending stairs that are no longer there. And it's the same thing over and over again. Gettysburg, we see constantly this recycling of certain events of Civil War battles. So that does seem to be again a real active phenomenon, but it doesn't appear that there's even necessarily spirits. Really, but it looks like an impression on space time itself that we're seeing something from the past because for whatever reason it's been impressed on that area. And again, we tend to forget we are supernatural beings, and so the fact that we're interacting or seeing the supernatural really should not come as a surprise to us. We are beings with souls. We are supernatural in and of ourselves. Um, but I will say this: I'm not really convinced that when we see intelligent hauntings that we're looking at ghosts of humans. I'm it's far the evidence seems to suggest again an intelligent haunting, yes, but that these are spirits that are not necessarily the spirits of the deceased, but rather, there's a long history of trickster spirits in every culture. Uh, we can call them demons, we can call them whatever you want, but I don't necessarily think there's a good consistent evidence of them being the spirits of the deceased, rather something else entirely. And again, that's more consistent with what we see with these intelligent hauntings. But again, going back to the question of of the supernatural.
Yeah, I was going to kind of compare some of the Bigfoot slash ghost
Hmm.
experiences that
Yeah.
you talked about earlier, where ghosts leave footprints. Bigfoot leaves footprints,
Yes.
oftentimes one, just 1 foot,
Hmm.
or they'll end in the snow, out so far. And ghost seems to have the ability sometimes to do that as well. Also manifesting as a real living human being. I've had several interviews I've done where people have encountered a person that they may or may not know.
Hmm.
Mostly they were people they didn't know, and they interacted with them to only find out that that person was deceased. But they
Yeah.
had a conversation. There was a physical context to them. Could Bigfoot possibly be presenting itself as flesh and blood? And maybe it is, maybe it isn't, and as well as the
Hmm.
ghost.
Right. And so so again, that's where I would go back to. We just don't know if again, the problem is everything we would work from are simply assumptions. Like I said, that's the issue with my thought is that so going back to the footprints issue, right? Because that's sort of an easier place to start. We do see ghosts or again spirits leaving uh handprints, footprints, things like that, but not necessarily of the same quality and consistency that we do see with Bigfoot tracks. The issue with the trackways ending in the snow kind of stuff is, I think, unfortunately, we have a lot of. I'm going to be very, very polite here, but it's just an observation. There's a lot of people who overestimate their tracking skills, and anyone who's hunted raccoons will tell you that they'll they'll back their way, like they'll leave tracks, but then they'll backtrack and they'll step in their previous tracks to lead hunting dogs or hunters astray. There's no reason to think that these creatures aren't intelligent enough to do that. Um, it's not so I'm not saying that these trackways aren't ending, and like I said, I'm not even saying that they aren't just disappearing, right? I'm definitely not saying that because I don't know that they aren't. What I'm saying is we tend to overlook some obvious things because a lot of people tend to overestimate their ability to track things. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, "Well, I've been in these woods, and I've never seen XYZ," and it's like, "Well, that's great, but it's there, whether you like it, not even Bigfoot, like normal things, right?" I heard one guy, it was clearly just a raccoon with mange that had been caught, and this guy's saying, "Well, I've hunted coon all my life, and I've never heard them make a sound like that." And I'm like, "Really? I grew up in the suburbs, and I've heard them make that noise all the time." We tend to overestimate our own abilities, our experiences with animals. So it's so again, I am not saying that those trackways aren't just stopping. What I'm saying is we need we need better data sets because it's entirely possible that these creatures were just backtracking to lead people astray because they knew they were being followed. If these creatures are survived by staying the hell away from us, right? Um, and if their entire survival depends on us not finding them. So I wouldn't be surprised. They're paying way more attention to us than we are to them. They're far more attuned, and they're probably going to be a little bit trickier than we would realize to stay away from us, to not be shot. Now, again, you still have plenty of stories of people saying, "Well, I know I shot it and it didn't fall." Again, we don't know which is which, right? And again, I'll do you one better as far as physicality. In Genesis, we have Abraham when he's encountering the three angels, right? Ostensibly God and two angels. He prepares food for them. They eat the food. There's plenty of stories of people entertaining angels, and these are beings that are able to not just interact with the world, but eat food. So there's plenty of reasons to believe that a higher supernatural being can take physical form, and that's not an illusion; it's a real thing. So, like I said, I can't discount that that's what's going on with Bigfoot until we have a body or we have a living one that's just hanging out for 5 years. There's just no way to know where these things begin and end. Again, if we look at Bigfoot real closely, there's a look at Bigfoot lore. It is one to one Fey lore, right? Um, I've heard there's been a lot of discussion of people talking about why Bigfoot braids horse manes, and they're calling him Bigfoot. They're out there weaving horses because they love horses, and I'm like, those are witches' braids. That's what they're called here in the West. But you go back to Ireland and Europe, they call them fairy knots, right? Um, the belief, there's a huge group within Bigfoot that believe that Bigfoot live in caverns under the ground and we just can't find the entrances. Well, that's straight up fairy lore, right? Where do the Fae live? They live under the earth. They live in the fairyland, which is under the earth, but you can't find them. You can't go into them. Josh Cutchwin, great guy. Really prominent research. He's really one of the most important researchers out there right now. Um, he's written a number of books. Ecology of Souls, I think, is one of the most important things he's ever written. But one of the things he points out in Where the Trackway Ends, I'm probably getting that title wrong. He points out, and I forget the name of the tribe, but there's a tribe in Alaska. This First Nations tribe tell you that, hey, if you know the hairy man, ostensibly what we would call a Bigfoot, if he gives you salmon, don't eat it because if you do, you'll stay in his world forever. But if you don't eat it, you'll find that it was just tree bark that he gave you. Well, that is literally exactly the same thing we see with Fey lore, right? Where you don't eat the food because if you eat the food that they give you while you're in their world, you stay in fairyland. You're trapped in fairyland. And again, the idea of fairy dust isn't, oh, if you sprinkle fairy dust on people, they'll fly. No, fairy dust was the Fae will give you something like gold, and you think, oh, it's cool, it's awesome. I've got all this gold. I've done all these things, and now and then of course, once daylight comes, and you get back into the human world, it turns to dust, or it turns into leaves, or it turns into whatever. That's where fairy dust comes from. It's that it was a thing that you got in the fairy world, but when you enter the human realm, it's gone. It turns to dust. It's oftentimes the same lore that we're seeing repeated over and over and over again. Um, so again, I'm certainly very, very open to the idea that the physical evidence that we see for Bigfoot that's indicative of being a living, breathing creature is just a manifestation of the supernatural um, into the material world. Because again, there is too much to say the supernatural can do that, to say that Bigfoot couldn't do it, or that what we call Bigfoot wouldn't be just that manifestation. But at this point, again, to say definitively yes or no would require more evidence than we have. What I can say definitively is there is what we call Bigfoot has a much larger paranormal connection than we want to necessarily admit to oftentimes, and that it's probably not Bigfoot. That whatever you're talking to, if you're talking to this thing, it's not a Bigfoot. That's just the form that it's taking, right? That is not what it is. It's simply whatever it wants to appear as to interact with you, which is why we have creatures doing the exact same thing. I've got reports of people like, yeah, I've got Bigfoot on my property, and it's 8 foot tall, it's covered in hair, it has horns, and I'm like, wait, stop, what? Right? I've got accounts of Dogman with cloven hooves. It's like, guys, stop. You're not describing a physical creature that just naturally exists in the world, like a dog or a cat or a cow. You're talking about something that's clearly supernatural. That again, it may be taking physical form, but what you're seeing is not natural. It is supernatural by definition.
How much do you think the person that is observing is participating in that co-creation of that experience of what they see?
Um, so that's a great, great question, and that's where we just don't know. I think it's clear. It is clear that this phenomena, right? Um, and I'm happy to call it demonic. I have no problem with that. Because I think that it is. But it interacts with people. It's very, very clear that it's interacting with people on levels that the person is willing to accept it on, right? Now, the question is, are we creating it in our minds and giving it form so that it's interacting with us, we just don't know. What I can say though is if you compare Phalor to Bigfoot or even to UFO encounters, right? Again, there is physical UFOs, absolutely. That's a whole other conversation, right? But if you look at the evolution of UFO belief over the last century, it's one to one. It's the same stories. It's just it went from being the Fae, and by the way, fairies are not little people, little people with wings or funny little hats. They're often you go back to the original actual stories, they often just look like humans, right? They're just weird. Sometimes they're smaller, but oftentimes they're just people, right? They don't have to be, this sort of Disney-fied version of everything that we think of. But if you look at a lot of UFO lore, it's one to one. It's the same thing, but instead of seeing a Fae, you see a little gray man. And by the way, we didn't see little gray men until like the 70s. You go back earlier, the accounts of aliens and extraterrestrials, they're all over the place. They look like you have the Hopkinsville goblins, right? You've got the Flatwoods monster or creature. They looked like stuff from the 50s. It isn't until Betty and Barney Hill, and even Betty and Barney Hill, you look at the original stories they're telling and their accounts, they aren't describing little gray men. That doesn't come until much, much later. And really until a movie is made about their encounters that we start seeing the little gray men. In fact, a lot of people point out those drawings that Barney Hill does later on that has something that more resembles the gray alien that we know today. That happened after an Outer Limits episode where a guy in makeup looked just like that. So what we have is a history of a supernatural force that is interacting with humans on levels that seem to be culturally understood. A friend of mine, Donnie Cho, his show Donnie Cho Says Stuff. That's one of the things we've talked about actually is that he's made a great point. There isn't this, we don't see alien abductions or UFO abductions in Korea or Japan or China. It's very much a Western level. He goes, but you know what is off the charts in Asia? Hauntings, the supernatural, ghosts, and things. He's like, people are encountering the supernatural, but in their worldview, it's the supernatural. Over here, we like to have the illusion of science, of materialism. So it seems to be taking that form when this stuff is interacting with us. And for those who are more open to Bigfoot, maybe it appears as Bigfoot. If you're more open to something else, maybe it can appear as that. We don't know what it really looks like. It may not have it, but it's hard to know where we are creating it. We are the co-creators of its appearance, and where it is simply assuming a shape that is culturally relevant to us. It's hard to know where those lines are because we don't got the Spookatron 5000 patent pending, right? There is no machine that we can put up to it and be like, oh, this is what's happening. We just can't know that objectively. But we can, what we can see is that it's very clear that it's both, right? It is highly specific when it interacts with us. Again, we see the same thing with the UFO phenomena. Um, it's very, very specific. It is very clearly interacting with us and our beliefs. But again, to know where those lines are, is it just is it just trying to assume a culturally appropriate shape? Uh, or is it drawing out of our own heads? We just don't know where those lines are.
Well, I think it goes back to like what you were saying about people, and they will call it what they're most familiar with.
Hmm.
They'll take this into some book they've read, some movie they've seen,
Hmm.
some story they've heard, that kind of fits into the paradigm of their reality. So they call it whatever
Yes.
fits.
One,
And
100%.
mhm. Including, the ghost phenomena, I think, and all of this. Now, at the beginning, you said you were a biblical paranormal researcher. What does that mean
Mhm.
exactly?
Well, it's designed to get you to ask that question. Um, so um, essentially, I'm coming at it from from a biblical worldview, right? There are certain assumptions that I make about the world, predicated on the Judeo-Christian worldview. Um, but my thought is again, if the Bible is true, if God is real, and the Bible is an accurate representation of the universe that we live in, again, open to a lot of vagary as to what that can mean, right? Uh, but the worldview by and large that is presented is accurate, then it should describe what we actually see in the world, right? When we dig things up, it should reflect what we see there. When we interact with the supernatural, it should be consistent with what we see reflected there. And the simple fact of the matter is, it is. Again, I've been in the cryptid and paranormal world for a very, very long time. I just didn't write for a long time. But it's far more, what we see in the world is far more consistent with a biblical worldview than with anything else. And that's why I labeled myself a biblical paranormal researcher, so people will ask the question. For example, again, specifics of when the flood of Noah would have occurred, right? It could happen 10,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 4,000, whatever. Let that be what it is, because that's more specifically the how, not the why. What we see in scripture is that there was a perfect world, perfect meaning optimized for life, right? To exist. There's a catastrophic event, and only a small percentage of the population is saved, humans and animals alike. Well, if that was the case, and that is what happened, then what would we expect to find? Huge amounts of diverse, abundant, and robust life before this cataclysmic event. That's what we find in the fossil record. We see animals of gigantic size. We see huge varieties of animals that we don't even see today. And then we would also expect to find that the animals that have survived are lesser versions of the ones that came before. And that's what we find. We can find a one-to-one parallel for virtually every animal that we know today in the fossil record, and they are vastly inferior to what they were before. My favorite example, because it's actually one of my favorite little prehistoric animals, is the glyptodont. The glyptodont was essentially an armadillo the size of a Volkswagen Bug. And now we run over them with our cars, right? They're here in Texas, the armadillo is a speed bump. That thing would have taken out your car and just walked off. Um, we see every animal that we have today has an obvious connection to what came before, but they were much larger, much more robust, and much more diverse. Again, we would expect to find artifacts that would have survived. We do. We find artifacts in fossil layers that shouldn't be there. Um, On to the paranormal. If the biblical worldview is true, then we would see things. We would expect to interact with supernatural entities, specifically supernatural entities that don't have our best interest at heart, and oftentimes they would be centered around particular areas of power. And we would see also, and particularly if prophecy is true, we would see a return of interest of these supernatural entities wanting to create hybridized creatures of themselves and us. We would also expect to see traditional Christian exorcism rites and practices interacting with these supernatural entities and ending these events. And we see all of that. Um, a lot of over the last few years, interacting more directly with people who are having constant paranormal activity, particularly mind speaking, quote unquote, with Bigfoot. I have seen a deterioration in their lives, in their mental states. They are going downhill. I've performed a lot of people who have either shadow people. I've got several stories that are just really outlandish, but they're absolutely true of people that I've helped with, um, entities that you would call shadow people, but took up far more diverse forms. Well, great. Essentially you perform an exorcism and they're gone. Same thing with UFOs. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of accounts of people who were being abducted and either call out to Jesus in the middle of the abduction and it ends, or a traditional exorcism is performed on them and everything's and the phenomena stops. We have we Again, going back to the hybridization, what happens post World War II as the UFO thing starts to rise? We start seeing more and more abduction stories. And then in the 70s and 80s, it becomes, hey, I'm being abducted. I was abducted as, when I was younger. Now I'm seeing these hybridized children. And then in the late 90s, in early 2000s, we started getting black-eyed children and more accounts of adult hybridized humans. These are just all consistent. These are consistencies with what we would expect from a biblical worldview. Same thing with most cryptids. Most cryptids of the physical nature, not the supernatural ones, although the supernatural ones again go back to, the paranormal aspect of it. But for the physical cryptids, most of them are just examples of creatures that we would have thought to have been extinct because they died out, quote unquote, millions and millions of years ago, like dinosaurs or unicorns, which are just uh, you know, a breed of rhinoceros. They're woolly rhinoceros. That's all they are. Um, Again, the dinosaurs being the most easy thing to point to and say this shouldn't be here. But again, if Bigfoot's a hominid, one of the really prominent suggestions is that it's Gigantopithecus. Well, that supposedly died out hundreds of thousands of years ago, or tens of thousands of years ago, depending on who you talk to. So we have, but that's what you would expect. You would expect that if the flood event occurred the way is described, then creatures would get off the ark and they would adapt to the environment, but there would be some creatures that retained the original form. They wouldn't necessarily adapt to the world around them. And in the same way, they may adapt a little bit, but they would seem very strange to us because they are far more reminiscent of something that existed pre-flood. They didn't fully integrate into the world around us. And because of that, they stayed in a much smaller population. A lot of these are what we call dragons, or what we think of as dragons. They were seen, they were interacted with, people called them dragons, and then they slowly start dying out because again of climate change. Our climate's much more erratic post flood. It used to be far more stable. It's more erratic now. But also because they are sort of antagonistic towards humans, we do what we do. We drive things extinct when we don't like them, and if it's a small population. Um, and so that's why I call myself a biblical paranormal researcher. It's to point out that, hey, everything that we are encountering fits within a biblical worldview. In fact, the biblical worldview would lead you to believe that you would find living dinosaurs, paranormal creatures that are malevolent to humans, and that material would be subject to traditional Christian exorcism rites, and that material would also want to breed with us to create a hybridized being for the end of the world. So we see everything that we're seeing and we are interacting with in Fortiana is is what you would expect to find within the biblical worldview and not any other. And that's why I do this. Because if that's the world we live in, then we need to interact with the world in that way. I'm I am very convinced now from what I've seen that people are much more vulnerable to the supernatural than they realize. Tex on Texas Front Porch, he coined this term, and it's so brilliant. I wish I'd come up with it. He calls it sudden acute possession. And I've talked to the girls on Blondes and Booze about this as well. If we're open to the supernatural, how many times do we see people say, and I've talked to police officers and they've said they've heard this all the time. It's a real phenomenon that people say, I don't know what came over me. I just started fill in the blank of whatever horrible thing that they did, right? It's like I was watching myself outside my body do this terrible, terrible thing. What if that's what that is? It is sudden acute possession. You were open to the supernatural. You didn't protect yourself. Most Christians don't even protect themselves the way we did a couple hundred years ago. We sort of adopted this modern idea of what science is and said, "Oh, that's what reality is." But it's not. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to Christians who are like, "Oh, I'm having these things happen in my house. What's going on?" Well, it's because you're not protected. You didn't protect yourself from this. You are imagine walking. I mean, if I were to walk around Texas and out in the woods, and I'm like, I don't believe snakes are real. I'm gonna put myself in a situation where I'm gonna get bit by a water moccasin or a rattlesnake or a copperhead, and I'm gonna suffer from that. Heck, if I'm out west of where I live, I could run across a coral snake and die. In Texas, you know snakes exist and you take precautions. You know you don't have to be scared of them, but you do need to know that they're there. In the same way, though, people are walking around unprotected from these supernatural entities, and it's leading to degradation of people's lives, their relationships with their family, their own mental health, and sometimes it's ending up in something much, much worse. They are harming themselves or others. This is the real world that we live in, and we need to interact with it. And all of this is simply the evidence. Like, I don't care what Bigfoot is. Let me say this I don't care what it is. I just want to know what it is so we can understand the world we live in better, right? If it's purely supernatural, and like I said, it's real hard with the encounters I've had to not say that that's the case. If it's all exclusively paranormal, cool. Then I know what it is and we know how to and how we should interact with it so as not to lead to greater harm. If it's both, there's a supernatural and there's a physical, great. I just want to know that. So again, we can interact with it safely. We know what the protocols are, right? Um, because we used to have protocols for all this stuff hundreds of years ago. We did. It's like, hey, there's certain things you just don't do because you don't want to because you're dealing with something that's predatory. I think the supernatural is far more predatory than we realize, and it has an ability to destroy our lives in ways that we're not ready for, and we're not even talking about in this community. And that's the broader part of my message is, hey, if there's living dinosaurs, if these things can be stopped with a Christian uh with a traditional Christian exorcism, right, then maybe it's because the Bible is real and these things aren't what they appear to be. Whitley Strieber's wife very famously said about the UFO and UFO abductions that she believed it had something far more to do with, and this is her words, what we call death than we realize. There's always been a connection between the paranormal, whether it's obviously ghosts or the fae. There's always been a connection between that and the spirit world, the 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 world that is supernatural to us. And when we've tried to disconnect all of this from that reality, because it makes us more comfortable to live in a materialist world, and it's just not a materialist world that we live in.